The morning Winifred Ashby arrived at Thornfield Park, she counted 11 bedrooms that had once been hers to run through as a child. One walled garden her mother had designed herself down to the placement of every stone path. And one Earl who set a muddy pair of leather gloves on the hall table in front of her and said, without looking up, "See that those are cleaned before dinner." She picked them up. She had her reasons. The carriage that brought her to Thornfield had been hired from the village coaching inn, modest and slightly musty from the morning fog, exactly the kind of carriage a woman of no particular standing would arrive in. Winifred had chosen it deliberately. She had also chosen her dress with care. Dark gray wool, well made but plain, her hair pinned without ornament. No brooch, no earrings. The only jewelry she wore was a small ring on her left hand, turned so the stone faced inward against her palm. She had looked at herself in the mirror of the inn that morning, and decided she looked precisely like what she needed to look like. Forgettable. The gates of Thornfield Park appeared through the carriage window just after 8:30, and something tightened in Winifred's chest. Not grief, exactly. Something older than grief and more complicated. She had not passed through these gates since she was 14 years old. She had stood in the same gravel drive with her father's hand in hers and watched the autumn light come through the copper beeches that still lined the approach. The beeches were still there. Everything else had changed because the man who had planted them was gone. And the house, her mother's house, the house her grandfather had built over 20 years from nothing, was currently occupied by an Earl who had no idea she existed. The carriage stopped. Winifred stepped down before the driver could assist her, caught herself, and slowed. She looked up at the front facade of Thornfield Park and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds to feel whatever was rising in her chest. Then she folded it away. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a tall, spare woman named Mrs. Calloway, somewhere in her late 50s, with eyes that moved over Winifred the way a customs officer moves over a piece of luggage, efficiently, looking for inconsistencies. Winifred let her look. She said her name was Miss Winifred Shaw, that she had responded to the advertisement for a household secretary, that she hoped the hour was convenient. Mrs. Calloway said the hour was fine and let her inside. The entrance hall of Thornfield Park smelled of beeswax and old stone and something faintly sweet that Winifred placed immediately. Her mother had kept a bowl of dried rose petals on the shelf beside the coat room. Someone still did. Winifred did not look at the shelf. She looked straight ahead and followed Mrs. Calloway across the hall toward the east passage, where the housekeeper explained in a tone of practiced efficiency that His Grace was occupied this morning, that Miss Shaw's duties would be outlined shortly, and that she would be shown to her room in due course. They were halfway down the east passage when a door opened to the left. He was younger than Winifred had expected. She wasn't sure why she had formed any expectation at all. She had only known the Earl of Thornwood from her cousin's letters, which described him as a man of considerable property, considerable impatience, and very little interest in anything that did not concern the running of his estate. The description, she would later conclude, was accurate on all 3 counts. He came out of the room at speed, pulling on his riding coat, already mentally somewhere else. He glanced at Mrs. Calloway, with the brief acknowledgement of a man who registered staff the way he registered furniture. Present, noted, not requiring further attention. Then his gaze moved past her to the hall table and the gloves he had apparently left there earlier. He picked them up, took in the mud caked along the cuff seams, and held them out in Winifred's direction without quite looking at her face. "These need to be seen to before dinner," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never in his life had to repeat himself. The assumption was total. She was staff. The gloves needed cleaning. The logic was immediate and required no discussion. Winifred looked at the gloves. She thought of 11 bedrooms. She thought of the walled garden and the stone paths her mother had laid out one by one. She thought of the ring on her left hand with the stone turned inward. She took the gloves. The Earl was already walking toward the front door, coat half buttoned, mind on whatever came next. Mrs. Calloway watched him go, then looked at Winifred with an expression that was not unkind, but offered no apology. "I'll show you to your room," Mrs. Calloway said. "Thank you," Winifred said. "That would be very kind." She followed the housekeeper up the stairs with the gloves in her hands and did not look back. She did not need to. She knew this house the way she knew her own breathing. Every staircase, every door, every place where the floorboards creaked and which direction the light came from in the afternoon. She had learned it as a child, had known every corner of it before she could read. The room Mrs. Nimison Calloway brought her to was small and clean and faced the side garden. Winifred set the gloves beside the washstand, removed her traveling coat, and went to the window. Below, the walled garden was visible through the arch in the old stone wall, and from here she could see that the lavender her mother had planted along the far border was badly overgrown. The central path was cracked. The climbing rose on the south wall, her mother's particular pride, had not been properly tied back in years. Winifred pressed one hand against the glass and looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and reached into the inner pocket of her coat. She withdrew a letter, folded, sealed with plain red wax, addressed in her father's handwriting. She had read it 6 times. She knew exactly what it said. She held it anyway and looked at his familiar script and allowed herself the private weight of it. She had not come to Thornfield Park because she had nowhere else to go. She had not come out of desperation or injury or any of the feelings that would have been understandable and entirely warranted. She had come because her father's letter had told her where to look, and because some things, some truths, some inheritances, some long-postponed reckonings could only be claimed in person. She set the letter on the bed, stood up, and picked up the muddy gloves. She supposed she might as well clean them. She had time. She was in no hurry at all. Winifred had cleaned the gloves. She had done it thoroughly and without resentment, the way she approached most things in those first days, with the steady patience of someone who understood that the present moment was not the final one. She had returned them before noon, set them neatly on the hall table, and said nothing to anyone about where they had come from or who had handed them to her. Mrs. Calloway outlined her duties that afternoon. She was to assist Lord Thornwood's aunt, Lady Parrish, who resided in the West Wing and required help with her correspondence and her accounts and, Mrs. Calloway added carefully, her tendency to misplace things. She was to keep the household records organized. She was to make herself useful and unobtrusive. Winifred said she understood perfectly. What she spent her first week doing was learning what had changed. Some things had not. The third step from the top on the back staircase still creaked on the left side. The door to the estate office still swelled in damp weather and required a shoulder to open properly. The window in the upper library still let in a draft from the northwest that made the curtains move on still days. And, on her third afternoon, walking down the west corridor at 4 o'clock, Winifred turned a corner and walked into a fall of amber light that came through the old wavy glass of the passage window, exactly as it always had, and she had to stop for a moment and simply stand in it. She recovered quickly. No one saw. What was different was harder. The study that had been her father's, where he had worked and read and where she had sat on the floor reading beside him while he pretended not to notice she was there, had been refurnished entirely. Different desk, different curtains, different smell. Winifred stood in the doorway on her second morning under the pretense of delivering a message for Lady Parrish, looked at the room for exactly as long as was natural, and walked on. Other things were harder still to anticipate. On her third morning, she was crossing the kitchen courtyard when she came upon the head groundskeeper coming around the corner with a barrow of early cuttings. His name was Archer. He had worked at Thornfield since before Winifred was born. He had taught her the difference between a climbing rose and a rambler. He had once let her steer the wheelbarrow down the main garden path while her mother watched from the upper window and pretended to be horrified. When Archer saw Winifred, he stopped completely. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he removed his cap and held it to his chest, not with the quick nod he gave to passing staff, but with the deliberate, unhurried gravity of a man paying a specific kind of respect. Winifred met his eyes. She gave the smallest shake of her head, barely a movement. Not yet. Archer put his cap back on. "Morning, miss," he said in the exact tone of a groundskeeper greeting a household secretary, and went back to his work. That evening, Winifred found a small bundle of lavender on the sill of her window. It was tied with a twist of garden twine, the same variety her mother had planted along the walled garden border. She put it in the water glass beside her bed and kept her agreement with herself about crying. The cook's name was Mrs. Tansey, a broad, warm woman who had been at Thornfield for 15 years and ran the kitchen with the authority of a seasoned general who had long since stopped needing to raise her voice. She had not known Winifred's family. She had no reason to recognize her. Yet on Winifred's 4th morning, she came down to collect Lady Parrish's breakfast tray and found it laid not with the modest portions set aside for household staff, but with a full and proper breakfast, soft rolls, good butter, a small pot of the expensive Darjeeling that was kept for guests, and a dish of honeyed figs that Mrs. Tansey produced only for company. Winifred looked at the tray. She looked at Mrs. Tansey, who was standing at the range with her back turned. "Mrs. Tansey," she said carefully, "I think there may be a mistake with the tray." "There isn't," said Mrs. Tansey, without turning around. Winifred said nothing for a moment. "I'm the secretary. I take my meals in the— You take what I give you," said Mrs. Tansey pleasantly, and turned around with an expression that dared the conversation to continue. Winifred took the tray. She did not ask how Mrs. Tansey knew. Some things in old houses move through the walls the way warmth moved through stone. Slowly, invisibly, and entirely. The house knew her. She had not fully anticipated that, and it shook her more than she expected. It also made her careful, because the house was not the only one paying attention. She first noticed it on the 5th day. She was standing in the upper corridor near the old portrait gallery, allowing herself the private indulgence of being near a set of rooms she had played in as a child. When she became aware that she was not alone, she turned. Lord Thornwood, the Earl, was at the far end of the corridor. He was not walking toward her. He was simply standing there, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not suspicion, more like the look of a man who has placed something in a category and then noticed it doesn't quite fit and isn't sure yet whether to revise the category or ignore the inconsistency. Winifred met his gaze. She did not look away first, which she suspected was not what he expected. He walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, that same assessing expression on his face. Then his gaze moved past her to the wall beside her, and Winifred turned slightly to follow it, and her breath caught for just one instant. The portrait was there. She had not come this far down the corridor yet, had not reached it. But here it was, directly beside her, and it was not covered. It had simply been rehung lower than she remembered, slightly off-center, as though moved by someone who did not know where it had originally been placed. The subject was a woman in a pale blue evening gown, painted at 3/4 length, standing in the very walled garden that Winifred could see from her bedroom window. She was perhaps 30, and she was smiling in the private way of a person caught in a moment of genuine happiness. It was Winifred's mother. Painted the summer she was 31, the year before Winifred was born. Winifred's hand moved before she could stop it. The smallest reach, instinctive toward the frame. She stopped herself, but not fast enough. "You know that portrait," the Earl said. It was not quite a question. Winifred looked at him. "I was admiring the light in it," she said. "The painter caught the garden very well." The Earl looked at her steadily. He clearly did not believe her. He also clearly did not know what the truth was instead, and that uncertainty sat on him like something he found uncomfortable. "The garden in the portrait," he said, "is the walled garden on the south side." "Yes," Winifred said, "my favorite part of the grounds, from what I've seen." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, briefly, and walked on. Winifred stood alone in the corridor. She turned back to the portrait. She looked at her mother's face, at the familiar angle of her chin, the exact quality of her smile, the way she stood as though she had grown from the garden itself. She touched the bottom edge of the frame. Just once. Soon, she said very quietly. To her mother, to the house, to herself. She straightened and walked on. The Earl's name was Devereux. Stephen Devereux. Winifred had known this from her father's papers, from the legal correspondence she had read before leaving her rented rooms in Bristol, from the documents that described in bloodless language the temporary administration of the Ashby estate pending resolution of the inheritance dispute. Language so clean and clinical it might have been describing the transfer of agricultural equipment. She did not think of him as Stephen. She thought of him as Lord Thornwood, or as the Earl, which kept things appropriately ordered. He was not, in her assessment, a villain. She had met her cousin Aldrich, and she knew what a villain looked like. His warmth practiced to the point of reflex, his sincerity calibrated to the room. The Earl was something more inconvenient than a villain. He was a man of ordinary assumptions and considerable authority, who had inherited a situation he did not fully understand and was operating with reasonable competence on incomplete information. She revised this assessment slightly at the end of her first week. A neighbor came to call. A Mr. Forsyth, perhaps 55, the kind of man who moved through the world with the easy assurance of someone who had never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. He arrived for a late luncheon, stayed through the afternoon, and at some point during that afternoon, Winifred was required to pass through the drawing room where the two men were sitting with their drinks. She moved through quietly, as she had learned to move through all rooms in this house, present but not demanding of attention. She was nearly to the far door when Mr. Forsyth noticed her. "Who's this?" he said, in the tone of a man noting something mildly diverting. Winifred stopped. She turned. She waited. The Earl glanced at her with the brief, neutral attention he generally applied to her existence. "My aunt's secretary," he said. "Miss Shaw. Is she?" Mr. Forsyth looked at Winifred with an attention that was entirely different from the Earl's neutrality and considerably less comfortable. He smiled. "Come here then, Miss Shaw. Let's have a look at you." Winifred did not move. Mr. Forsyth's smile adjusted slightly, accommodating mild surprise. "I said, come here," he repeated pleasantly, but with a new quality beneath the pleasantness. "I heard you," Winifred said. Her voice was polite. It was always polite. "I'm afraid I have something urgent for Lady Parrish. Please forgive me." She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Mr. Forsyth make a sound of amused indignation. She caught a word, something dismissive, and then she heard Lord Thornwood's voice cut cleanly across whatever Forsyth had intended to say next. "You were telling me about the fence dispute with the Cleve farm," the Earl said. His voice was even, easy, carrying the full weight of a man redirecting a conversation with complete authority. "I'd like to hear the rest of it." Winifred paused in the doorway. A fraction of a second, no more. Then she walked through. In the corridor she stood still for a moment and allowed herself to be genuinely surprised. She filed it away with everything else she observed in this house. It didn't change her situation. But it changed the shape of the Earl in her mind, slightly. He was not indifferent to everything then. He was selective about what he chose to notice. The question was, what determined the selection? She found out more before the week was out. Lady Parrish was not a difficult woman. She was nervous and voluble and had a talent for mislaying spectacles, and she talked at considerable length about the inadequacy of the London season since the 1890s. But underneath the chatter, she was not unkind, and she had taken to Winifred with the warm relief of a woman who is lonely and has found someone who actually listens. She talked. Winifred listened. In listening, she learned a great deal. She learned that the Earl had been engaged 3 years ago to a Miss Hartwell, considered an excellent match by all parties. She learned that the engagement had ended under circumstances Lady Parrish described only as deeply unfortunate. With an expression suggesting she had formed strong opinions she had been advised to keep private. She learned that the Earl had returned from a period in Scotland, quieter than he had left, and that Lady Parrish found this worrying in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She also learned, with considerably greater interest, that Winifred's cousin Aldrich had visited Thornfield Park 3 times in the past 6 weeks and was expected again within the fortnight. This she had already suspected. The confirmation pressed against her ribs like a cold hand. She had 10 days, perhaps fewer. It was during the 2nd week that the Vane family arrived. Miss Constance Vane was 24, beautiful in the way of a woman who has been told so consistently and from such an early age that she has organized her entire presentation around the fact she arrived with her mother, a formidable woman, named Mrs. Aldous Vane, and the quietly assured manner of someone who expects to be well received in every room she enters, and usually is. Winifred watched her with professional attention and personal wariness, because within the first 2 days she had observed that Miss Vane in private was a notably different proposition from Miss Vane in the drawing room. In private, Miss Vane spoke to the household staff the way certain people do when they have learned that there are no social consequences for it, not with heat, which might be understandable, but with the flat, efficient dismissal of someone who has never particularly considered that it mattered. She corrected. She criticized. She looked through people the way one looks through a window. She took a particular dislike to Winifred almost immediately, with the instinctive antipathy of someone who has recognized something that doesn't fit the expected arrangement. On Miss Vane's 2nd evening, she appeared in the upstairs corridor where Winifred was carrying letters for Lady Parrish. She was dressed for dinner, every detail perfect, and she looked at Winifred with the flat expression Winifred had already come to recognize. "You there," she said. "My left cuff button has worked loose. Come and see to it." Winifred looked at her. She considered the several responses available. Then she said, "Of course," and followed Miss Vane into the guest room. She fixed the button. She worked slowly and carefully, as she did most things, and as she worked, Miss Vane stood above her looking at herself in the glass and said, almost to herself, "I cannot imagine why the Earl keeps his aunt here. The woman talks incessantly. Does nobody in this house have any real purpose?" Winifred said nothing. She finished the cuff. She began to rise, and as she did, she brought her face close to Miss Vane's ear and said, very quietly, 4 sentences. The exact content of those 4 sentences belonged to Winifred and to Miss Vane and to no one else, but the effect was immediate and complete. The color left Miss Vane's face, not in a flush, not in anger, but in the particular way color leaves a face when something has been said that the listener did not expect anyone alive to know, and must now rapidly calculate what the knowing of it means. Winifred stepped back and smoothed her skirt. "Your cuff is secure," she said. "Enjoy your dinner, Miss Vane." She left the room. She closed the door behind her. In the corridor she walked 6 steps, and then, when she had turned the corner and was entirely alone, she allowed herself to smile. It was small and private and entirely alone. She allowed herself to smile. It was small and private and entirely her own. Small satisfactions. They kept a person going. Downstairs the dinner bell rang. Winifred went to collect Lady Parrish, and as she guided her along the upper corridor toward the stairs, they passed Lord Thornwood coming the opposite direction. He glanced at Winifred briefly, as he generally did, then he paused. "Are you well, Miss Shaw?" he said. The tone was correct, perfunctory, the tone of a man completing a social requirement. But he had stopped. "Quite well, thank you, my lord," Winifred said. He nodded and moved on. Lady Parrish patted Winifred's arm absently. "He notices more than he shows," she said, to no one in particular. Winifred said nothing, but she thought about it for the rest of the evening. She thought about the drawing room and Mr. Forsyth. She thought about the corridor and the pause. She thought about the gap between the man she had been told to expect and the man she was observing, and the stubborn inconsistency between them. It did not change her plan. She reminded herself of this clearly, but that night, sitting at the small desk in her room with the lavender in its water glass and the sound of the wind against the walled garden, she allowed herself one question she had not previously permitted. What kind of man would he be, she wondered. When he finally knew the truth, her cousin Aldrich arrived on a Wednesday. She had known before she heard the carriage. She had been watching the drive from Lady Parrish's window with the practiced inattention of someone whose embroidery appeared to have her complete focus. His name was Aldrich Ashby. He was her father's nephew by the elder brother's line, a branch of the family that had maintained a cordial surface with her father for 30 years, while quietly positioning themselves to benefit from his death. He was 53 now, silver at the temples, well-dressed with the particular effort of a man who wants to appear more substantial than he is. She had not seen him in 4 years. She did not expect that 4 years had made him less dangerous. She was not in the entrance hall when he arrived. She had arranged not to be. She watched from the upper gallery as he was admitted below. Hat taken, handshake extended to Lord Thornwood, warm and practiced. She watched the Earl receive him with the neutral courtesy he applied to most visitors, and she watched her cousin's eyes move over the entrance hall with the quick cataloging attention of a man reminding himself of what he was building toward. Then he looked up, not at Winifred. She had stepped back into the shadow of the gallery. He looked up at the house itself, and on his face was an expression she recognized without pleasure. Ownership. Anticipated ownership. The look of a man mentally installing himself. She went back to Lady Parrish and her embroidery and said nothing to anyone. She had 8 days. She moved that same night. The estate office was at the end of the east wing. Winifred had walked past its door a dozen times without stopping. It was kept locked. She had noted the lock on her second day. The type, the age, the slight wear on the keyhole plate that indicated frequent use. She had also noted that Mrs. Calloway's keyring contained one key that did not correspond to any door she had yet been able to account for. Mrs. Calloway's keyring hung on its hook in the housekeeper's room every evening from 9:30 onward. Mrs. Calloway slept soundly. Winifred had established this by listening for 5 consecutive nights. She did not steal the key. She borrowed it for 12 minutes, returning it to its hook before the hall clock had finished its progression past the quarter hour. In those 12 minutes, she moved through the estate office by candlelight with the focused precision of a person who knew exactly what she was looking for. Her father's letter had been specific. In the estate office, behind the original paneling on the right side of the chimney breast, there is a space built into the wall when the house was first constructed. Your grandfather used it. I have used it. You will find it because I'm telling you now, and because you are your mother's daughter, which means you will not give up. The panel was where he had described it. The space was behind it. Inside, wrapped in oilskin against the damp, was an envelope. Winifred did not open it that night. She replaced the panel, returned the key, and got back into bed with the envelope inside her coat, which hung on the back of the door. She lay in the dark and let herself breathe fully for the first time in days. She opened the envelope the next morning before the house was awake. It contained 3 things: her father's will, properly signed, properly witnessed, dated 14 months before his death. A letter from the family solicitor in Bristol confirming the will's existence and the filing of the original with the appropriate court, and a note in her father's handwriting that said only, "I knew you would find this. I am sorry it came to be necessary. The house is yours. It has always been yours. Come home." She read the note 4 times. Then, she folded everything back into the oilskin, placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, and went downstairs to collect Lady Parrish's breakfast tray. Mrs. Tansey gave her the good tea without a word. Winifred drank it standing at the kitchen window, which was not what household secretaries did, and Mrs. Tansey did not comment. Archer came in from the kitchen garden with the first of the autumn vegetables, took one look at Winifred's face with the accuracy of a man who had known her family for 30 years, and gave a single slow nod. Winifred nodded back. The days that followed were the most careful she had yet navigated. Aldrich was charming at dinner. She could hear him from the corridor, his voice carrying that practiced warmth, planting things in conversation the way he always had. Patient and thorough and relentless. He was working on Lord Thornwood. She could hear it in the rhythm of it. She understood the shape of his strategy more fully on the third day of his visit, when she paused outside the estate office door, which did not close fully in damp weather. She had noted this. She had noted everything, and heard her own name, Miss Shaw. Her cousin was saying in the tone of a man reluctantly sharing something painful. I feel it is my duty to speak plainly, since I understand you have engaged her. She's my uncle's daughter. I have a genuine concern for her, but I must tell you, and I say this with considerable regret, that she has a history of making claims she cannot support, about property, about her circumstances, about documents that, when examined, have never been found to exist. I have tried to help her. I want you to understand that. But if she has said anything to you about the estate, about any supposed— She has said very little to me about anything, Lord Thornwood said. Good. Her cousin's voice settled with satisfaction. That is reassuring. The legal process surrounding the estate is entirely settled, your lordship, properly resolved. I only mention it because I would not wish any confusion to arise from things she might claim. Winifred stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds. She counted them. Then she walked on. She was not surprised. She had known this was coming. Aldrich had been building this particular architecture for 3 years, managing perception, pre-discrediting any claim she might make, ensuring she would arrive already disbelieved. She had known, and yet hearing it said in her father's house, to a man who had, she had observed this, filed it carefully, begun to look at her with something other than casual neutrality, produced in her chest an anger that was cold and very specific and entirely unexpected in its sharpness. She breathed through it. She was still breathing through it when she heard the footsteps in the corridor above, and then on the stairs, and then stopping outside the door of the small sitting room where she was pretending to sort correspondence. The knock was firm, unhurried. She opened the door. Lord Thornwood stood in the corridor. His expression was the controlled one she knew, but something underneath it had shifted. Your cousin tells me you have made claims before, he said. Direct, no preamble. She found she could respect that even now. About the estate, claims that were found to be without basis. Winifred looked at him. She felt the cold anger in her chest, precise and contained, and she made a choice. Did he show you my father's will? She said. The Earl said nothing. Not a description of it, she said. Not a copy, the original document, signed and witnessed, with the solicitor's seal. Did Aldrich Ashby show you that? Silence. My lord, Winifred said. And there was something in her voice that had not been there before in all her weeks at Thornfield Park. Not desperation, not heat, but a quality of absolute stillness that was perhaps more striking than either. You are making decisions about a significant piece of property. Before you make them, I would like to ask you one question, and I would like you to answer it honestly. She held his gaze. In all your dealings with Aldrich Ashby regarding this estate, have you ever seen my father's original will? Not a copy, the original. The Earl was very still. Something moved in his expression. Not doubt, not belief. The particular look of a man who has just understood that there is a question he should have asked some time ago and did not. He did not answer. He did not need to. Thank you, Winifred said quietly. That is what I thought. She began to close the door. His hand came flat against it, not forcefully, just enough to stop it. Miss Shaw, he said. She waited. He seemed to be deciding something. Then, be careful. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was 2 words, said low and level, that communicated with minimal efficiency that something in his calculation had not resolved itself, but that she should not walk alone in the dark. Winifred looked at the hand on the door. She looked at his face. I have been careful, she said, for quite some time. She did not close the door again. He removed his hand and walked back down the corridor. She watched him go. That night she lay awake until past midnight. She thought about the envelope in her coat. She thought about 6 days reduced to 4. She thought about a man who had not answered her question, and what that silence might mean, and whether it meant what she thought it meant. And then, past 2 in the morning, she heard it. A sound from the direction of the east wing. Soft, deliberate, and entirely wrong. The estate office. Winifred was out of bed before she had finished thinking. She pulled her coat on over her nightgown, lit the candle, and moved into the corridor with steady hands and steady feet. She walked to the end of the east wing. The estate office door was standing open. The estate office door was standing open. The lock had been disengaged. Someone who knew how had done it, and it had not taken them long. She pushed the door open and walked in. Aldrich stood on the far side of the room with a lantern in his hand. The chimney breast panel pulled away from the wall, staring at the empty space behind it. When he turned and saw Winifred in the doorway, his face moved through several expressions before settling on the one he had decided to deploy. "My dear," he said, with the warm sorrow of a man deeply pained by what he was observing. "What are you doing here at this hour? I heard something. I was concerned." "You heard nothing," Winifred said. "The room is at the end of the wing. No one hears anything from here." He stopped. She looked at the empty space behind the panel. She looked at his face. "It isn't there," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "Whatever you came to find, it isn't there anymore." Her cousin went very still. "I wondered when you would try," Winifred said. She stood in the doorway of the estate office in her father's house, with her candle and her coat and the envelope against her ribs, and she looked at the man who had spent 3 years dismantling everything her father had built, and she felt nothing she was willing to show him. "I think," she said quietly, "that you should go to bed." She held the door. After a long pause, Aldrich walked past her and out into the corridor without a word. His shadow stretched long against the wall as he went. Winifred waited until his footsteps had faded. Then she went back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, placed one hand over the envelope inside her coat, and held it there in the dark. 4 days. She could do 4 days. The next morning, Winifred came down to find Aldrich already in the small sitting room off the kitchen, which was not where he took his meals and which meant he had come deliberately. The warmth was gone from his voice now. What was left was the real voice, efficient, stripped of its performance. "You have something," he said. "I want to know what." "Good morning, Aldrich," Winifred said. She poured her tea. "Don't." He set down his cup. "Whatever you believe you have, it will not hold. I have spent 3 years ensuring that anything you say arrives already discredited. I have spoken to the right people. I have managed the legal record with considerable care. Any document you produce, I will have questioned and set aside before you can place it in front of a magistrate." He looked at her steadily. "You are a young woman with no standing and a history of delusion, which I have taken considerable pains to establish." Winifred drank her tea. She set the cup down. She looked at her cousin across the table. 3 years, she said. "You said you spent 3 years on this." He waited. "My father was ill for 18 months before he died," she said. "You began before he was gone." Aldrich said nothing. "I know," Winifred said. Not with heat. Simply as a fact stated. "I have known for some time. I want you to understand that clearly, not so that you feel caught, but so that neither of us wastes the other's time." She stood. She smoothed her skirt. "I believe you're expected in Lord Thornwood's study this morning. I would use the time between now and then to think carefully about what you intend to say." She left him at the table. The condition in her father's will was this. The estate would pass to Winifred, but the claim must be registered in person before a qualified legal witness within 14 months of his death. The 14 months expired in 4 days. She needed a solicitor or a magistrate or someone with the authority to receive her claim formally and record it before the deadline closed. She needed it without Aldrich knowing it was happening until after it was done. She was working through the logistics of this, had been working through them since 2 o'clock in the morning. When the knock came at Lady Parrish's sitting room door, it was one of the footmen. He addressed himself to Winifred, not to Lady Parrish, which was irregular. His lordship would like to see Miss Shaw in the library at her convenience. Lady Parrish looked at Winifred with mild curiosity. Winifred excused herself and walked to the library. The Earl was at the window when she entered. He turned. He looked like a man who had not slept particularly well, which she could not blame him for. He said without preamble, "Sit down." Winifred sat. He was quiet for a moment. He moved away from the window. "Your cousin came to see me this morning," he said. "He told me you are," his word was troubled, "that you have a history of making claims that cannot be verified, that any document you might produce should be viewed with considerable skepticism." "Yes," Winifred said. He would say that. He has been constructing that account for 3 years. That is a very specific number. It is a very specific case. Lord Thornwood moved nearer but did not sit. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen in the corridor outside the portrait gallery, the one that sat beneath his usual composure, like something not yet certain what it intended to become. "He told me," the Earl said more slowly, "that you were in the estate office last night." "We were both in the estate office last night," Winifred said. "He arrived first." A pause. What was he looking for? "The same thing I found 3 days ago." The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of a man reassembling several things at once. "You found something," he said. "Yes. 3 days ago." "And you said nothing?" Winifred met his gaze. "I was waiting," she said, "to understand what kind of man you were." The Earl was quiet. Then, with the directness she had learned was characteristic of him even when it cost something, "And have you?" It was a genuine question. Not defensive, he actually wanted to know. Winifred looked at him, at the set of his jaw, at the way he was standing, close enough to be direct, far enough to give her room. She thought about Mr. Forsyth and the drawing room. She thought about the corridor and 2 words said low and level. She thought about the fact that she had been in this house for weeks and had not once seen him be cruel. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are a man who makes assumptions quickly and revises them slowly. I think you are given a situation you did not create and have been managing it with the information available to you, which has been deliberately incomplete. I think you are not my cousin's instrument, which was not something I was certain of when I arrived." The Earl looked at her for a long moment. "That is not entirely a compliment." "No," Winifred said, "but it's what I believe." He sat down then, across from her, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was not the posture of a man performing his title, and said simply, "Show me." Winifred reached into the inner pocket of her dress. She placed the envelope on the table between them. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he knows will change things, taking one last breath before the change. Then he picked it up. He opened it carefully. He read. He read slowly, which she appreciated. He read the will first, all the way through. She saw the exact moment he reached the ownership clause, something shifted in the line of his jaw. He read the solicitor's letter. He read her father's note last. He was quiet for a long time when he finished. Then he set the documents down on the table with the care of someone handling something that mattered. He looked at Winifred. He said, "Why didn't you simply tell me?" She had prepared an answer for this. A measured, reasonable answer. She did not give it. "I needed to know," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she had intended, "what you would do with the power to discredit me before I put it in your hands. My cousin has spent 3 years ensuring my word alone is worth nothing. If I had arrived at Thornfield and announced myself and shown you this document on the first morning, you would have had two choices: believe me or believe him. And you had every reason to believe him and none at all to believe me." She stopped. I have known men who would have used that. The Earl was very still. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, with less protection in it than anything she had yet observed. "The gloves," he said. His voice was different. "The gloves," she said. He stood. He went to the window and stood with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders and the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man at rest. "The deadline," he said. "When?" "4 days." He turned. "I need to go to London. Tonight." He held her gaze. "You will come with me. We will be at your solicitor's office before noon tomorrow. The claim will be registered before your cousin understands we have left." He crossed to the table and held the documents out to her. "Keep those on your person." Winifred took them. She looked at them in her hands. She looked at him. "Why?" she said. Genuinely. She needed to know. He seemed briefly thrown by the question. "Then, because it is the right thing to do." A pause, and then, as if the admission cost something, "and because I handed you a pair of muddy gloves." Winifred looked at him for a moment. "The button on my left cuff is loose," she said. The Earl blinked. "I'm joking," she said. She stood. She smoothed her skirt and placed the documents carefully back inside her dress. She walked to the library door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back. "My lord," she said. He looked at her. "My father's note." "The one at the bottom of the envelope." She held his gaze. "I would like it back when this is finished." "Of course," he said. She nodded. She left. In the corridor, she walked 6 steps and stopped and pressed one hand flat against the wall of her father's house and breathed. Then she straightened and went upstairs to pack. They left at 10:15. Winifred came down to the rear entrance with her traveling coat and her small trunk and the envelope against her ribs and found the Earl already there with 2 horses and no carriage. He looked at her trunk. He looked at the horses. He said, "We'll make better time. Can you ride?" "I grew up on this estate," Winifred said. He helped her mount with the impersonal efficiency of a man performing a practical function, and they rode out through the rear gate and down the back lane, away from the main drive. Winifred had ridden this lane as a child, in the dark, with the smell of the autumn fields around her and the sound of hooves on packed earth. She felt the particular disorientation of a familiar place seen in the wrong light, known in structure, strange in feeling. They stopped past midnight at a coaching inn to rest the horses. The Earl procured tea and bread without being asked, and they sat across a rough table in the empty front room and ate without ceremony. "Your cousin will know by morning," the Earl said. He was looking at the table. "Yes. He'll go to your study first, find you gone. Then he'll find Mrs. Calloway. She'll tell him I left with you because she's honest and because he'll press her." "She might not," the Earl said, in a tone that suggested he knew his housekeeper rather better than she suspected. "She might not," Winifred allowed. "But he'll assume London. He'll send someone after us. He won't get there before we do. But he will be close behind, which means the filing must be completed before noon." "I understood the necessity of noon before we left," the Earl said, with a dryness that surprised her almost into smiling. They reached London in the grey early morning, the city assembling itself out of the mist the way it always did, gradually and then all at once. Winifred knew the solicitor's office on Clement's Lane. She had sat across from Mr. Ferby twice before, had placed in his quiet, careful hands her father's letter and her own account of events, and had watched him listen with the grave attention of a man who takes the measure of things slowly before committing. He had committed. He had told her, "When you are ready, come to me." She had written to him 4 days ago. They arrived at 8. Mr. Ferby was there. He opened the door himself and looked at Winifred with the expression of a man who has been waiting and is relieved the waiting was finite. Then he looked at the Earl behind her and spent a brief moment reassembling his expectations. "Miss Ashby," he said. She had not told him she was going under another name. She felt the Earl, a step behind her, register the name. She did not look back. "Mr. Ferriby," she said, "this is the Earl of Thornwood. He is here as a witness." What followed was 2 hours of the most thorough legal work Winifred had ever witnessed. Mr. Ferriby read every document twice. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable. Winifred answered them all with the accuracy of a person who had been preparing for this conversation for a considerable time. The Earl sat in the corner and said nothing unless addressed. When addressed, he answered with the directness of a man who understood that the weight of his presence in the room was doing its work without embellishment. At one point, Mr. Ferriby looked at him over the top of his spectacles. "You are prepared to provide a signed statement confirming you were present for the examination of this document and observe no irregularity?" "I am," the Earl said, "and you are prepared to stand behind that statement if it is challenged in court?" "Mr. Ferriby," the Earl said, with a patience that had a very slight edge beneath it, "I have ridden through the night to be in this room. Yes, I am prepared." At 11:53 in the morning, Winifred signed her name to the formal claim. Mr. Ferriby signed below it. The Earl signed as witness. Mr. Ferriby signed below it. The Earl signed as witness. Ferriby pressed his seal into the wax with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of the moment, and then he set down the seal and looked at Winifred and said quietly, "It is done, Miss Ashby. The claim is properly filed. The estate is yours." Winifred looked at the document, at her name on it, at her father's name above it, at the seal that made real what had always been true. "Thank you, Mr. Ferriby," she said. Her voice was steady. She was rather proud of that. They were back on Clements Lane by noon exactly, and Winifred stood on the pavement in the grey London morning and breathed. The Earl stood beside her. He was looking at the street with the expression of a man who has completed a task and is now taking stock of what comes next. "It will still be challenged," he said. "Yes, Aldrich will file a counterclaim within the week. There will be proceedings. It will take time." She looked down the street. "But the deadline is met. The deadline is met." They were quiet for a moment. Then, with some effort, the words coming out of him like something assembled with care, "I owe you more than an apology for the gloves." Winifred looked at him in the morning light. Away from Thornfield, away from the roles the house had required of both of them. He looked tired. Not weak, just honest in the way that people sometimes are when the formal scaffolding of a situation has come down. "You owe me nothing," she said. He turned to look at her. "That's not you owe me nothing," she said again, more gently. "You came when I needed you to come. You signed what needed signing." She paused. "That is more than I had any right to expect." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she did not examine too closely, because she was tired and the moment was already sufficiently weighted without additional complication. "We should eat," he said finally, "before we ride back." They found a quiet place near the Strand and had a proper meal for the first time in 2 days. They did not talk about the estate, or the documents, or Aldrich, or anything that mattered in the legal sense. They talked about small things, about London in the morning, about the booksellers near the museum, which Winifred mentioned she had frequented during her 2 years in the city. The Earl said he had not been in a bookshop in over a year, which she told him was a significant personal failing. He looked briefly startled, and then, unexpectedly, for the first time in all her observing of him, he almost smiled. She filed it away without comment. They rode back to Thornfield in the afternoon, arriving as the low autumn light was coming through the copper beeches, long and golden across the drive. Winifred was tired in the way that goes past the body into something older. The tiredness of sustained effort permitted at last to ease. She was thinking about sleep when they came through the front door and found Mrs. Calloway in the entrance hall with an expression that stopped Winifred where she stood. "My lord," Mrs. Calloway said, and then, carefully, "Miss Shaw," the way she said it. "What has happened?" the Earl said. Mrs. Calloway looked between them. "Mr. Ashby, before he left this morning, he spoke at some length with Lady Parrish." A pause. "Lady Parrish has been given to understand certain things about Miss Shaw's character and intentions. She has requested that Miss Shaw's employment be ended and that she leave before dinner." The entrance hall was very quiet. Winifred looked at the floor she had run across as a child. She looked at the wall where her grandfather's clock had stood for 40 years. She looked at Lord Thornwood. His face was controlled, the neutral face she had catalogued in the early days. But underneath it, something was happening that the control was working very hard to contain. He said nothing. He did not say the things that would have resolved the moment in 30 seconds. He said nothing, and Winifred understood, with the clean completeness of something arriving whole, that his aunt's distress sat on him with a weight she had not accounted for. That whatever had been said to Lady Parrish had been carefully chosen to land exactly here, in exactly this manner. That the man who had ridden through the night and signed his name beside hers was now standing in an entrance hall between his aunt's instruction and his own conscience, and he had not yet moved. Winifred made the decision for him. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "Even," she was very good at even. "I'll be no more than an hour." "Miss Shaw," the Earl said. "It's quite all right." She did not look at him. "I won't be long." She walked up the stairs. She walked down the corridor to her small room and closed the door and stood in the middle of it with her coat still on and the envelope still against her ribs. She counted to 30. Then she opened her trunk and began to fold things into it with the methodical precision of someone who has packed quickly under difficult circumstances before and knows that the hands must be occupied when the mind cannot afford to be. She had nearly finished when she noticed the lavender, the dried bundle Archer had left on her windowsill, the one she'd replaced twice from the garden. Past its best now, starting to lose its color. She looked at it for a moment. She left it where it was. She sat at the small desk and wrote a letter, unhurried, clear, in her father's hand as much as her own. When she finished, she left it folded on the desk, unclosed. Then she picked up her trunk and walked out of the room and did not look back. She carried the trunk downstairs herself. Mrs. Calloway made a movement to assist. Winifred declined with a smile. Mrs. Tansey appeared from the kitchen passage and her face did something complicated and painful when she saw the trunk. Winifred shook her head very slightly. "Not yet, but it's coming." She asked for a carriage and waited in the entrance hall. She looked at the front door. She did not look at the passage that led to the portrait gallery. Lord Thornwood appeared on the stairs. He came down them with the look of a man who has reached a decision and is not entirely at peace with it. Winifred watched him descend and thought, "Here is the shape of it." She had wondered, she realized, nearly from the beginning, in the spaces between the things she had been disciplined enough not to want. He reached the bottom. He stopped. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her face. He opened his mouth. "Please don't," Winifred said. He closed it. "Whatever you are about to say," she said quietly, "I would prefer you didn't. I am tired, and I have the document, and the claim is filed, and I will be perfectly fine." A pause. "I always have been." She picked up her trunk. She walked out the front door of Thornfield Park into the cool evening air. The carriage came. She got in. She did not look back as they drove down the Copper Beech Drive. She looked straight ahead. She held the envelope against her ribs with one hand, and the edge of the seat with the other, and she breathed. On the desk in her room at Thornfield, the letter she had written sat open on the desk. It said, "My lord, I have left Mrs. Calloway's key on the hook in the housekeeper's room. I borrowed it twice." She may have noticed. You should know. The climbing rose on the south wall of the walled garden requires tying back before the first hard frost. Archer knows how my mother preferred it done. He has been waiting for someone to ask. The portrait in the gallery passage is my mother. Her name was Catherine Winifred Ashby, née Crail. She was 31 when it was painted, and she is standing in her garden wearing the blue evening gown because my father asked her to, and she could never refuse him anything he asked quietly. When the house is mine, I would like the portrait moved back to its proper place, 3 feet higher, slightly left of center, where the afternoon light reaches it at 4 o'clock. That is where it has always belonged. I do not write this to make you feel anything in particular. I write it because these things should be known by whoever lives in this house, and you have lived in it, and perhaps you will remember. Thank you for London. Entirely, and without qualification. Winifred Ashby. The Earl read the letter standing at the small desk in the room that smelled faintly of lavender. He had come looking for her 40 minutes after she left, had stood in the entrance hall for most of those 40 minutes saying nothing to no one, and then had gone upstairs with the particular set of a man who has made a decision and is moving before he can unmake it. He read the letter twice. He stood at the window and looked at the walled garden in the dark, at the far wall where the climbing rose was, invisible now in the evening. He thought about what he had done at the bottom of the stairs. He had done nothing. He had stood there and let her walk out the door with her trunk and her dignity and the envelope pressed against her ribs, and he had said nothing, and he had watched her go, and he had told himself there were reasons, reasonable, practical, legitimate reasons for the silence. He understood now, standing at the desk with the letter in his hand, a coward. Not on the road, not in the solicitor's office, there, at the bottom of his own stairs. In the one moment that had not had a correct answer he could execute, only a choice between the path of least resistance and the expression on Winifred Ashby's face. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat pocket. He left the room. He went to find his aunt, who was in her sitting room with her embroidery and the look of a woman who had managed something and expected to be agreed with. She looked up. Stephen. I think it was for the best. Aldrich explained. Aldrich Ashby, the Earl said, has been illegally administering an estate that does not belong to him for 3 years, while his cousin prepared to reclaim it. He came here to prevent that from happening, and he used you to do it. Lady Parrish stared at him. He told you she was unstable. He told you she made claims that couldn't be verified. He looked at her steadily. Every word of that was a construction. I sat in a solicitor's office this morning and watched Winifred Ashby place a properly executed will in front of a man who has been waiting for it. A pause. She owns this house and she has always owned it. We have been living in it. The silence in the room was considerable. Lady Parrish set down her embroidery. She sat with it. She looked at her hands. She never said a word, she said finally. Not with defensiveness, almost with wonder. No, the Earl said. She didn't. A pause. She was very good with my nerves, Lady Parrish said quietly. Most people don't actually listen. I know. His aunt picked up her embroidery and set it down again. Where is she now? I don't know, the Earl said. That is what I am about to address. He went to find Mrs. Broffin, Calloway, who was not a woman who dissembled and who told him plainly that Miss Shaw had taken a carriage to the coaching inn at Whitfield Cross, 3 miles east, with the intention of catching the late coach toward Bristol. 3 miles, the Earl said. Have Piton saddled, and went to change his coat. He was in the stable yard 12 minutes later when Archer appeared from the direction of the kitchen garden. The old man looked at the Earl with an expression of complete, unhurried assessment that reminded him with sudden and clarifying force of the expression he had seen on Winifred Ashby's face the morning she had walked into this house. Whitfield Cross, the Earl said. She left an hour ago. How long does the late coach hold for Bristol? Archer was quiet for a moment. Depends on the night, he said. Wednesdays, the horses are slower coming in from Caldwell. Stage usually runs late. It's Wednesday, the Earl said. Yes, said Archer. It is. The Earl said. Yes, said Archer. It is. The Earl mounted. He looked down at the old man. The climbing rose on the south wall, he said. She wants it tied back before the frost. Her mother's way. Archer looked up at him. Something shifted in the old man's face. The expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is watching the patience begin to matter. I know how, Archer said. I've been waiting for someone to ask. The Earl nodded. He rode. He rode hard on a clear night on a dry road with the particular focused urgency of a man who has identified precisely what he should have done 2 hours ago and is correcting the error with all available speed. What he intended to say when he arrived was not entirely clear, which he set aside on the grounds that some things could not be prepared, only arrived at. The coaching inn at Whitfield Cross was lit warmly against the dark. The stage was still in the yard. He could see it. The horses not yet changed. The coachman in conversation with a man about the luggage arrangement. He pulled up and dismounted and went inside. The front room was low-ceilinged and warm and smelled of wood smoke and old timber. There were perhaps 15 people in it. He scanned the room with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly who he was looking for. She was in the far corner. Her traveling coat on, her small trunk at her feet, a cup of tea in front of her that she was not drinking. She was sitting with the stillness she always had, looking at nothing in particular, very much inside her own thoughts. She had not seen him yet. He crossed the room. She looked up when he was 3 feet away, and her face, her composed, steady, patient face, did something it had not done in all his weeks of observing it. The composure held. And then it did not entirely, in what was underneath it for one unguarded moment, was something he recognized in his own chest. She recovered, of course. "My lord," she said. Her voice was even. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was not particularly proper, and he did not particularly care, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table, because he had ridden 3 miles in the dark specifically to look at her directly, and he was not going to waste it. "I stood at the bottom of the stairs," he said, "and I said nothing." She did not answer. "That was wrong," he said. "Not legally. The claim is filed. You are protected. That part is resolved. But it was wrong. You walked out of your own house carrying your own trunk, and I stood there." He paused. "I had reasons. They seemed like reasons at the time. They were the habits of the man who has learned to manage things from a distance and call it prudence." She looked at him with the expression he could not categorize. He was beginning to think he never would, and was making his peace with that. "Your aunt," she began. "My aunt knows," he said. "I told her everything. She is." He considered the word revising. "She has good instincts when someone is not actively working against them. And she said you were very good with her nerves." Something moved at the corner of Winifred's mouth. "The legal proceedings will begin next week. Your cousin will file a counterclaim. Mr. Ferriby estimates 6 to 8 weeks for formal resolution. During that time, the estate remains in a complicated position." He held her gaze. "I would like you to come back to Thornfield Park, not as a secretary, not a staff, as its owner, while the proceedings run." She looked at him. She looked at the trunk beside her. She looked at the room around them. And then she looked back at him. And the coaching inn moved around them with its noise and its warmth and its complete indifference to either of them. "There is something else," he said. He reached into his coat. He produced a document. Not the will. Not the solicitor's letter. Older. The paper slightly yellowed, the handwriting faded but legible. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her. "I found this in my father's papers when I inherited the title," he said. "I read it and did not understand it at the time and filed it away. I understand it now." Winifred looked at the document. She reached out and picked it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The name at the top was not. Her father had written to his father, years ago before any of it, when both men were still alive and neither family had reason to imagine what was coming. The letter asked one thing: if anything should happen to me, her father had written, and Winifred is left alone. Watch for her, if you are able. She is more capable than she will be given credit for, and she will not ask for help, and she will need someone who is willing to see past the not asking. Winifred read it to the end. She held it for a moment. She set it down between them. She looked at the Earl. He looked at her. The letter lay between them with the weight of two men who had trusted each other across years and distance, and the particular gravity of things that have been true for a long time before they are said aloud. "He knew your father," Winifred said. "Apparently," said the Earl, "better than either of us knew." Outside, the coachman called the last boarding. Neither of them moved. "In the library," the Earl said. "You told me you needed to know what kind of man I was before you put the power to destroy you in my hands." "Yes. And do you know?" She looked at him for a long moment. The coachman called again. The stage would leave without her. "I think," Winifred said slowly, "that you are a man who rides 3 miles in the dark to a coaching inn on a Wednesday because he stood at the bottom of a staircase and said nothing, and he could not let that be the last thing." The Earl held her gaze. "That is a very specific observation." "I am a very observant person," Winifred said. She looked at the trunk beside her. She looked at the door. She looked at the man across the table who had ridden through one night for a legal document and through another night for an entirely different reason, and who was looking at her now with the expression she had given up trying to categorize because some things did not require a category. "The portrait," she said, "in the gallery passage. It will be back in its proper place before you return," he said. "Tonight." She looked at him. Then she reached across the table and picked up her father's letter, and held it for a moment and placed it carefully inside her coat, next to the other one. "I'll need a moment to speak to the coachman," she said. "Take whatever time you need," the Earl said. She went. She came back. She picked up her trunk. The Earl had stood, and he looked at her with the expression she had finally decided to simply name. He was looking at her the way her father had looked at her mother in the portrait, the way a man looks when he has stopped pretending he doesn't. "Well then," Winifred said. "Well then," said the Earl. They walked out of the coaching inn together, into the clear Wednesday night. Above them, the sky was wide and full of stars, and the road back to Thornfield Park stretched ahead of them, pale and certain in the dark. He helped her mount. His hands were steady. So were hers. They rode. A year later, Thornfield Park in autumn was the particular kind of beautiful that Winifred had carried with her through 2 years of rented rooms in Bristol and 1 winter in a house that smelled of other people's lives. Knowing a thing and standing inside it were different. She had learned, in the years since she had ridden back down the Copper Beach Drive on a Wednesday night with stars overhead, to let herself stand inside it, without the old habit of holding good things at arm's length in case they proved temporary. They had not proved temporary. The legal proceedings had taken 10 weeks, not 6, because Aldrich Ashby had filed his counterclaim with the aggressive thoroughness of a man with nothing left to lose. He had challenged the will's execution, the witness signatures, the filing date, and the condition clause. Mr. Ferby had addressed each challenge with the unhurried precision of a man who had been preparing for exactly this opposition for considerably longer than Aldrich had been preparing to mount it. The Earl's signed testimony had been, as he had predicted in Mr. Ferby's office on Clements Lane, not easily discredited. The estate was formally returned to Winifred Ashby on a Thursday morning in November. Mr. Ferby's letter arrived at breakfast. Winifred read it at the proper dining-room table, where she had been taking her meals since the morning after her return, and set it down and looked at the window for a moment without speaking. Lady Parish, who had developed the habit of joining her for breakfast on the grounds that it settled her nerves better than anything else, looked at her face and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," Winifred said. Lady Parrish reached across the table and patted her hand with the warm efficiency of a woman who had completed her revision and arrived, several weeks prior, at a genuine and uncomplicated fondness. The apology had come as the Earl had predicted, through 2 indirect conversations and 1 long meditation on the general untrustworthiness of men who smiled too readily, and then one morning over tea. Direct and clear, "I am sorry, my dear. I was used badly and you paid for it." That was wrong. Winifred had accepted it without theater, and they had both been relieved to move on. Aldrich Ashby had left the county before the proceedings concluded. His name was not spoken at Thornfield Park. This was not a rule anyone had stated. It was simply understood. The proceedings had also uncovered, during their final weeks, certain irregularities in his management of the estate finances. Irregularities that Mr. Ferraby had referred quietly to the appropriate parties. Winifred had noted this and moved forward. What she had not moved forward from, what she had moved steadily and deliberately toward, at the pace that both of them seemed to require, was the Earl. Stephen. She had started thinking of him as Stephen sometime around the 4th week after her return. He had started calling her Winifred. Not Miss Shaw, not Miss Ashby, Winifred, around the same time. Neither of them had remarked on the transition, which she thought was characteristic of both of them. They had talked. This, she had discovered, was the central fact of it. They had talked in the library, in the walled garden, on horseback along the eastern boundary where the fields ran long and flat, and the conversation had room to breathe. He had told her about the engagement that had ended. A Miss Hartwell who had not waited, whom he did not blame, he said, though it had taken him a year to arrive at not blaming, and about the quietness that had come back with him from Scotland, which he described not as grief, but as recalibration. She had told him about Bristol, about the 2 years of planning and waiting with intention, which her father had taught her was its own kind of action, about her mother, the real woman, who had loved that walled garden in all weather, who had known the name of every plant in it, who had laughed easily and without self-consciousness, and had been, by every account, entirely herself. He had listened. There was a difference, she had learned, between observing that a man could listen and having him listen to you. The difference had mattered. He had asked her one evening in November, with a directness that was his form of gentleness, whether she would consider making the arrangement permanent. He had not said the logical thing. He had said, "I have been trying to picture the library without you in it for the past several weeks, and I find I can't manage it, which I suspect means something, and I would rather know what you think it means than spend another month being sensible about it." Winifred had looked at him across the library. Her library, their library, the room where the children's books were still on the 3rd shelf from the floor because that was where they had always been. And she had thought about 11 bedrooms and 1 walled garden and 1 man who had handed her a pair of muddy gloves, and 1 man sitting across from her now who had not looked past her since approximately the 5th day. She said yes, simply and directly the way she said things she meant. Now it was autumn, a year from her arrival, and Thornfield Park was full of copper light and the particular smell of a garden tended well. The portrait of her mother hung in its proper place in the gallery passage, 3 feet higher, slightly left of center, returned to it the night Winifred came back from the coaching inn. The afternoon light reached it at 4 o'clock and made the blue gown in the painting warm and particular. Winifred stopped to look at it most days as she passed. The walled garden had been properly tended since early spring. The climbing rose cut back and trained along the south wall the way Archer had always known how to do it. The lavender border cleared and renewed. It had come back in September with the unreasonable abundance of things that have been properly cared for after years of being merely maintained. Winifred had stood at the window the morning she first saw it in full bloom and felt something complete itself that had been waiting a long time to be finished. Archer still removed his cap when she crossed the kitchen courtyard. He still did it with the specific gravity of a man giving a specific kind of respect, the kind he had been withholding for years and was now free to extend. Winifred still gave him the small nod she had given him on that 3rd morning. It had become, between them, a private language. Mrs. Tansey still gave her the good tea. This had simply become the order of things. In the entrance hall, on the side table near the coat room, inside a small glass case that Stephen had commissioned from a craftsman in the village, and installed himself one Sunday morning without telling her what he was doing until it was done. A pair of muddy leather gloves sat on a square of dark velvet. He had not cleaned them. She had asked him why, and he had said that cleaning them would have been beside the point, and she had looked at them in their case and thought that he was right. Guests always asked about them. There was something about a deliberate display that compelled inquiry, something about the evident intentionality of the choice that suggested a story was there to be found. And there was always someone at every dinner who could not resist asking. Winifred always answered. She told it simply, the way her father had taught her to tell things, without embellishment, without performance, without any of the drama that would have been entirely warranted and that she had never particularly needed. She told it the way it had been, a woman who arrived in her own house without announcing herself, who picked up a pair of muddy gloves and said nothing and waited. Because she had learned over a long time that some truths needed space and patience and the right witness before they could exist properly in the world. Because waiting with intention was its own kind of courage. Because some houses, some rights, some people were worth every quiet, careful, deliberate day of the wait. She told it, and people listened. At the part with the gloves, there was always a moment of delighted outrage. At the estate office, there was always held breath. At the coaching inn, there was always something in the room she could feel without being able to name. Stephen listened every time. He had heard it perhaps a dozen times now. He stood at the edge of whatever room she told it in, with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize and simply recognized. And when she reached the part about the coaching inn, he always looked at her with that expression, and she always, without quite intending to, looked back. He told his version occasionally. It was shorter, characteristic. It ended with, "I stood at the bottom of the stairs and said nothing. Then I got on a horse." He delivered this with the self-deprecation of a man who has made his peace with a specific failure and considers the peace honestly earned. Winifred always said, "He rode 3 miles in the dark and I would like that noted." It was always noted. On an evening in late October, a year and 3 weeks from the morning Winifred Ashby had stepped down from a hired carriage and walked into her family's house for the first time in years, she sat in the walled garden as the light came down. The climbing rose was at its autumn best. The air was cool and still and carried the smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness of the last roses, which was the smell of her mother's garden, and everything she had carried through the years of waiting. Stephen came and sat beside her. He said nothing immediately, which was one of his better qualities. He sat with the ease of a man in a place that fit him, and she sat beside him with the same ease, and the garden settled into evening around them. After a while, he said, "Archer says the east border wants new edging before the ground hardens." "I know," Winifred said. "I told him to go ahead. He was waiting for you to tell him. He always waits for me." Stephen was quiet for a moment. "You've been telling this garden what to do since you were a child," he said. 8 years old, Winifred said. "I started listening to it at 6. He looked at her. She looked at the roses. The autumn light was the particular gold of the season at its height, the kind that didn't last, and she was paying attention to it in the way she had learned to pay attention to good things, fully, without the old habit of bracing for loss. She reached out and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers back without ceremony, the way he did everything she had come to rely on. Quietly and completely, and without any apparent intention of letting go. In the entrance hall, in their glass case on the dark velvet, the muddy gloves sat exactly where he had placed them. Guests always asked. Winifred always smiled, and she told the story of a woman who had learned the difference between patience and passivity, who had understood that waiting with intention was its own kind of courage, and that some houses, some truths, some people were worth every quiet and deliberate day of the wait. She never mentioned that the woman was her. She never needed to.